All right, so this goes to ratifying the Constitution. The convention votes to send its proposed Constitution to Congress. It's then, which was actually sitting in New York, with a cover letter from George Washington. So the plan for adopting the new Constitution, however, requires approval from special state ratification conventions, not just Congress. So during this ratification process, critics of the Constitution organized to persuade voters in different states to oppose it. So there's people who don't want to pass it. Importantly, the Constitutional Convention had voted down a proposal from Virginia's George Mason, who was the author of Virginia's State Declaration of Rights, and he proposed a national Bill of Rights. And this omission came as a rallying point for opponents of the document. And the opponents that opposed ratifying the Constitution were known as anti-federalists, which you need to know for quiz and test purposes. Anti-federalists did not want to ratify the Constitution. And they argued that without a guarantee of specific rights, American citizens risked losing their personal liberty to a powerful federal government. However, the pro-ratification Federalists said that if you include a Bill of Rights, that it's not only redundant, like you're just repeating yourself, but it's dangerous, and it could limit the future citizens from being able to add new rights later on. Citizens debate the merits of the Constitution in newspaper articles, letters, sermons, coffee house quarrels all across America. Some of the most famous and most important arguments came from Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison in something called the Federalist Papers, which are published in various New York magazines from 1787 and 1788. The first crucial vote came at the beginning of 1788 in Massachusetts. At first, the anti-federalists at Massachusetts really, had the upper hand. But after weeks of debate, enough delegates changed their votes and they narrowly approved the Constitution, but they also approved a number of proposed amendments which were submitted to the first Congress. This pattern, which was to ratify the Constitution but attach amendments, was followed by other state conventions. The most high-profile convention was held in Richmond, Virginia in June of 1788 when the Federalists James Madison, Edmund Randolph, and John Marshall square off against some anti-federalists Patrick Henry and George Mason. Virginia was America's most populous state. It produced some of the country's highest profile leaders, and the success of the new government rested on Virginia's cooperation. So after nearly a month of debate, Virginia votes 89 to 79 in favor of ratification. Then on July 2nd of 1788, Congress announced that the majority of states had ratified the Constitution and that it was now in effect. But that didn't mean the debates were over because North Carolina, New York, and Rhode Island had not finished their process yet. And so the anti-federalists continue to argue that the Constitution is going to lead to tyranny. It doesn't matter, though, because they've already passed it. The New York Convention does ratify the Constitution by just 3 votes, and Rhode Island is the last to ratify by 2 votes an entire year after George Washington had already been elected president. So they were like, we finally ratified it, everybody. And Washington's like, dude, I've been president for a year. Thanks. Great. So it's pretty funny there. There was also some major debates about that continued here in this section. Washington's election as president kind of cemented the Constitution's authority. And by 1793, the term anti-federalist basically was meaningless. Yet the debates did produce a piece of the Constitution that seems irreplaceable today, which is the first 10 amendments that are added in 1791. And we call them the Bill of Rights. James Madison, against his original position, which was that he did not want a Bill of Rights, he actually ends up supporting them because if he didn't, they would not have elected him to the House of Representatives for Virginia. So he basically had to change his position to get elected. There was a whole lot the Bill of Rights didn't cover. Women did not find special protections or guarantees of their voice in the government. A lot of states continued to restrict voting only to men who owned significant amounts of property, and slavery not only continued to exist, but was kind of condoned and protected by the Constitution. Of all the compromises that formed the Constitution, perhaps the most important would be the compromise over the slave trade. Americans generally perceived the transatlantic slave trade to be more violent and immoral than the slavery itself was. You do need to understand this for quiz and test purposes, that many Northerners opposed it on moral grounds. Okay? But they also understood that letting southern states import more Africans would also increase those southern states' political power because of the representative by population size of the 3/5 compromise. So the Constitution, as we said, counted each individual black person or each individual slave as 3/5 of a purpose. So they were like, hey, not only are we opposed to letting it continue on moral grounds, but if we continue to allow the slave trade to exist, the southern states are going to be more powerful because they're going to have bigger populations. So the people in the upper South actually welcomed the ban on the Atlantic slave trade because they already had too many slaves to begin with. This meant that banning the importation meant slave owners in Virginia and Maryland could get higher prices when they sold their slaves in states like South Carolina and Georgia because there was already too many, supply and demand. Then for quiz and test purposes, you need to know what this compromise was called, and it was called the Dirty Compromise. So the Dirty Compromise, here's what it did. New England agrees to include a constitutional provision that protected the foreign slave trade for 20 years. And in exchange, South Carolina and Georgia agreed to support a constitutional clause that makes it easier for Congress to pass commercial legislation. So it's easier for Congress to pass laws about commerce. In return, they allow the slave trade to continue for 20 years. And then it's going to end. As a result, the Atlantic slave trade resumed until 1808, and then it was outlawed for 3 reasons. First, Britain starts outlawing the slave trade themselves, and the United States doesn't want to be shown up by the British on moral grounds, right? Second, you have the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804. It's a successful slave revolt against the French colonial rule in the West Indies, and it really starts to change their stake in this debate. The images of thousands of black armed revolutionaries terrified white Americans in the South. They were like, oh crap, we're going to get so many slaves that they're going to rise up and kill us all like they do in the Caribbean. Third, the Haitian Revolution ended France's plan to expand in the Americas, so they got to get rid of some land. In 1803, the United States purchases the Louisiana Territory from the French, and this massive new territory, which doubled the size of the United States, put the question of slavery's expansion at the top of the agenda. A lot of white Americans, including President Thomas Jefferson, thought that by ending the external slave trade and dispersing the domestic population, that this would keep the United States a white man's republic and even possibly lead to the disappearance of slavery eventually. The ban on the slave trade, however, lacked effective enforcement measures and funding. Instead of freeing illegally imported Africans, the act left their fate to the individual states, and many of those states simply sold them at auction. So the ban preserved the logic of property ownership in human beings, and the new federal government protected slavery as much as it expanded democratic rights and privileges. And that's that right there. The end.